There were only 9 foreign samurai in history, and only 1 came from the continent of Africa. 1 black samurai. And with the new release of Assassin's Creed Shadows, I want to delve into today the story of Yasuke, the true story of the world's only black samurai. This is episode 4 of Phase Shift History, about an absolute giant of a man, an enigma to the Japanese people, and one of the fiercest samurais to walk the earth. If you enjoy this type of content, please like and subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get all notifications. Yasuke arrived in Japan under ambiguous circumstances. Not much is known about his past. There are theories. He might have originated from the Dinka people in South Sudan. He might have also been a part of the Makua ethnic group, which was located in Mozambique, and he also might have been a Muslim, but it's hard to tell his religious roots. One thing that is agreed upon is that he was likely abducted as a child from his village in whatever African tribe he was a part of, and somehow he ended up in India, likely sold as a slave to India. Not much is also known about his time in India, but because he was such a big powerful man, he was kind of more used as a security, and his masters in India, they like to keep hidden, so he spent much of his time behind the scenes, always preparing for assassination attempts, but who he worked for and where he ultimately was not truly known. It's thought maybe he won free of slavery through warfare, or potentially just through good service, and he might have ended up a freelancer, but the important thing is he somehow found his way into the service of an Italian man by the name of Alessandro Valignano. Valignano was a Jesuit missionary, and he wanted Yasuke as more of a scare tactic, a big, strong, powerful bodyguard. He did not want him hiding in the shadows. He realized Yasuke's best asset was his intimidating presence. Valignano was a man of God, and he was considered the visitor to the Indies by the Pope Gregory XIII, and Valignano's name was well known in most circles. It was said that his name alone could move armies. It could also assemble fleets, and it could also raise cities. But that was once upon a time, and this story is not about him. At this point in time, he's an old man, and he's just a missionary, trying to spread the good faith to the east. Valignano also believed that black people were inferior, just like most people in Europe at the time period, but he very quickly learned to entrust his entire life to Yasuke, because Yasuke proved to be very trustworthy from the get-go. Yasuke was said to be in his early 20s when he arrived in Japan, and this was in 1581, in late July, and he mostly just worked as a bodyguard for trader ships underneath Valignano. These merchant ships carried Chinese silk, scrolls of learning, different types of medicines, and most importantly, guns. And I think you need to understand how massive Yasuke was. He was said to be taller than 6'2", which, when he arrived in Japan, the average height for men in Japan was under 5'2". So this guy's a full foot and more taller than the average man in Japan, and heavily muscled. Just a massive dude. And their mission so far had been very successful, trading along the Chinese and the Indian coast, but the final destination was Japan. That's where the money was to be made, the real money. And so they were not the only Jesuit ship that had been heading there. The whole mission was converging on Japan. Once they got near enough to the coast, they were actually approached by another ship. And from a distance, it looked scary because they've had issues with pirates in the past. So they thought, oh shoot, this might be a pirate. So everybody was getting prepared for a big battle to come. And everyone was really on edge after such a long voyage to get there. But as they got a little bit closer, they realized it was actually just another Jesuit ship. And once they got close enough, they saw Brother Ambrosius, which was this portly, sturdy, battle-hardened fellow, and he was actually meant to catch them en route to Japan to change their destination, because they were supposed to head into Nagasaki, which was their most successful port so far. But a local lord in Nagasaki was not playing by the rules, and so the Jesuits needed to switch tactics, and Ambrosius said that they needed to head to Kochinotsu instead. This local lord, Lord Omura, had not been very accommodating to their mission overall, so they were going to go meet up with his rival instead. Unfortunately, this added another day's travel, and they were exhausted, so they were not happy about this. On top of that, Nagasaki was a trusted port, and Kochinotsu was just a small town that was considered relatively unsafe. But Kochinotsu was a strong Christian town at the time period. When they arrived, a lot of villagers were wearing crosses, and they lowered their eyes in deference to the Jesuits, and a lot of them were singing Catholic hymns as they passed through. Valignano himself was considered a demigod by the people, and as he was walking past them, he was giving them a blessing in Latin. When they got to the end of the procession, they met up with the local lord, who was the rival of Omura. His name was Lord Arima Harunobu. He was a boy ruler, very young. He had a wisp of a mustache, very spindly. Already upon arrival, people were terrified of Yasuke because they had never seen a black person before, most of them at least. There were rumors that there were black gods in India, and some people thought that maybe he was one of those gods from India. So that added to the mystique and the terror and the fear. So they were invited to a feast. feast. But this feast was terrifying to Yasuke because he had been used to the sturdy buildings in India, and if you know anything about Japan, they usually had paper-thin walls back then. Yasuke was used to being hidden all the time. He could not stay hidden in this scenario. He was afraid that anything could fly in through these walls. So it was a major adjustment for him. In this meeting, Arima had said to them that his castle is under siege. He essentially needed their help, their guns, their assistance. In return, he would become a Jesuit. The next day, they went to Arima's castle by boat. The local population in this region was fiercely anti-Catholic, and if they had been caught, they would face death by the local populace. Arima's castle, called Hino Castle, was basically just a fort. It wasn't that strong, and they were being besieged by this enemy army that was way bigger than them, so they were in trouble. If they wanted to get in the castle, they had to sneak in a small retinue, and they also could not get supplies into the castle. But they knew hidden ways to get in, and they were able to sneak in as a small group, where they had another meeting. Arima used to be staunchly anti-Catholic, but knowing that Valignano had access to these specially made cannons from India, he immediately flipped a switch, knowing that it was his only chance for survival. And in return, he also had to agree to be baptized. But the problem in negotiations was that Arima had a mistress. According to the Jesuits, that was immoral. And so throughout this whole meeting, Yasuke was smirking at Arima's exuberance for Catholicism, combined with the fact that he was desperate and had to give up his ways of life. The main reason they had agreed to meet with Arima and not Omura was that Omura agreed that his daughter would marry Arima, but the daughter refused. And that, combined with Omura's waning Catholic desire, essentially forced the Jesuits to pull their guns from him and go to his rival. Really what the Jesuits were good at was playing both of them against each other. They had already turned Nagasaki into a formidable city when it used to be just some series of fishing huts. That's how the Jesuits kept both leaders on their toes. So they agreed to help Arima and protect his city. Stranded in Japan, he spent the next 9 months between Kuchinotsu and Kazusa, which was a small village that was converted from a Buddhist temple to a seminary where they opened up a Jesuit school. The Jesuits loved education. It was second only to faith, and that's why they were so good at proselytizing. In these early days, Yasuke spent most of his time training and learning from actual samurai, and reportedly engaging in dalliances with local women when Valignano could not see him doing it. They visited many local lords during this time, and Yasuke never had to do much. Valignano was able to very skillfully avoid conflict, even though there was lots of conflict going on between all these local lords. One very important trait about Yasuke is that he was a very learned man. He learned Japanese very easily. He quickly adapted to Japanese culture. He learned to read and write. The other Jesuits really struggled with the language, but to Yasuke it was second nature. After a series of months of pitting these young lords against each other, Valignano actually gained full control of Nagasaki. The city doubled in size. Once they had full control, he gave Yasuke the charge of the training for the entire militia for the city, which was a big responsibility. And this is where Yasuke started to build his reputation. This militia became a formidable force. They were an army of ronin, which were considered refugees or masterless warriors. With Nagasaki under control, it was time to move on to a new mission. So Valignano headed off to Utsuki, which is where the second most powerful lord in Japan lived, by the name of Otomo. And Otomo was a staunch Catholic supporter, but he was also a womanizer who cheated on his wife a lot. He actually ended up betraying his wife and leaving her for a much younger woman. Problem is, his wife had a lot of people in her side. She had very high status, and there were a lot of detractors on her side who believed that this new Catholic faith was no good for the people. So a lot of people in this land wanted the Catholics gone. For the first time since he arrived in Japan, Yasuke actually had to keep an eye out for assassins, because Otomo's wife had the power and influence over Otomo's son, who ruled another section of the northern province. This created somewhat of a cold war between the two groups of people, where they weren't truly at war with each other, but there was just so much animosity between the groups of people. This led to assassinations and other major scuffles and brawls. Otomo's wife had already tried to assassinate her husband many times. She had staged several coups to try to retake the region. So during this time period, Yasuke had to deal with many assassination attempts, most of which were directed towards other Japanese who were Catholic. Luckily, Valignano was not a major target, but at one point in time, he did have to save the daughter of Otomo with his new wife from a burning building when it was set on fire, and that's just one example. But they were really there for two main missions. Number one, to establish a new seminary for the Jesuit faith, and number two, more importantly, to organize a pilgrimage for young Japanese men to return to Europe and to learn about their customs and ways. Yasuke was actually very excited about this because he had always wanted to visit Europe. He thought this was going to be an opportunity for him. But at some point, they received a missive that explained that the Jesuit mission had experienced a major setback in Kyoto, which is the capital. This is where Lord Oda Nobunaga resided, and one of his sons had experienced a major defeat in battle, which made the Jesuits Jesuits look bad in that region because he was defeated by a bunch of shinobi who were staunchly anti-Catholic. Those were basically the ninjas at the time, or Japanese assassins. This was actually a very good opportunity for both sides. Nobunaga needed extra support after his son's failure, and Valignano needed permission to organize this European trip that he's preparing. Because Nobunaga was the most powerful lord in Japan, this took priority. Throughout this journey to the capital, Yasuke became very much a focal point of all these villagers. He was a wonder, and these were very populated areas now, no longer these small villages. Crowds were pressing in on him everywhere he went. They were obsessed with seeing this giant, dark-skinned man. Several times as they went through these towns, they had to beat back villagers off of him. So you can imagine when they arrived in Kyoto to a massive spectacle of thousands and thousands of people, as well as troops and a bunch of horseback shows, with tens and thousands of people who were drunk from outlying villages, people playing pranks, ladies are flashing the crowd. It was raucous. So as soon as Yasuke came there, you knew it was going to be a problem. As they were marching through the throngs of people, people came up to Yasuke and started ripping at his clothes. The further they went, the more the mob clamored over him. These brawls started breaking out amongst the people. Other guards from the city had to come in and defend Yasuke because they were basically trying to suffocate him out of curiosity. Eventually, they had to run down a side alley as people were trampling over palanquins and crushing everyone around them to get to see this dark-skinned man. And to avoid being crushed themselves, the Jesuits had to run as fast and as hard as they can to get inside the Jesuit church. As soon as they got inside, they locked the doors behind them. While they were locked in the church, the crowd clamored outside and actually kept screaming, "Let him out! Let him out!" They were so obsessed with this man. It got so out of control that Nobunaga actually had to order his generals to come in and help with the situation. In this scenario, General Hideyoshi, who's a character who's going to come in much later in this story, actually came in with his mounted troops and drove away the crowd. Hideyoshi himself came inside once the crowd was dispersed and said, "You're expected to see Nobunaga." Valignano stepped forward and said, "Yes, I'm expected." But Hideyoshi said, "No, not you." He pointed to Yasuke and said, "You're expected." So the Jesuits were a little confused, but they kind of understood, considering the circumstances. And so Yasuke was summoned alone to see the most powerful lord in all of Japan. When he arrived at the palace of Nobunaga, it was an amazing place. It was by far the grandest building that Yasuke had ever seen. Once he got inside, they replaced his garments with much finer robes, and he was ushered in to meet this great lord. He bowed before Nobunaga. He got low to the floor, which was the custom. Oda Nobunaga had never seen a black man before either, just like most of the people of Japan. He didn't believe that Yasuke's skin was real, so he actually made him undress from the fancy robes that he was in. He had servants wash his body to try to get the skin color off, but as they scrubbed at his dark skin, it just got darker. And so Nobunaga laughed and said, "Oh, okay, I guess your skin is real. This is so strange." Him and his sons were both fascinated. So Nobunaga ordered a feast of all of his greatest retainers and said, "You all must meet this man with extremely dark skin." He had Yasuke seated right next to him at the head of the table, and they had a private conversation where he bombarded Yasuke with questions. Once again, Yasuke impressed him with his extensive knowledge of the military and also of foreign countries. As I said, he was a very brilliant man. He spoke fluent Japanese, so he was the hit of this party. He even performed party tricks. They wanted to see how strong he was, so they're like, "Yeah, pick up these women, see what you can do." He picks up 2 women very, very easily, and they're like, "Wow, you're really, really strong." And then he picked up a bunch of women at once. They were just amazed. Everybody laughed and they were joking around. They all had a really, really great night. Nobunaga actually gifted him with a giant box of coins for being such a entertaining presence for his party. The next day, Valignano actually had his audience with the great lord. The lord told him all about how much he loved Yasuke. Valignano, being the intelligent traitor and diplomat that he is, in order to sweeten the deal with this great lord to get the Jesuit mission completed, he offered him these very expensive crystal glasses, and on top of that, an ornate throne for his palace, and on top of that, he offered him Yasuke as a servant, to which Oda Nobunaga agreed wholeheartedly. At first, Yasuke had mixed feelings on this. He was feeling a little bit sad about being betrayed by Valignano and being removed from the Jesuit party, but he also was excited to work for this extremely powerful lord. He began as just a regular bodyguard, and he had to stand all day protecting his king. Apparently, it was very tiring to just stand in one spot all day long. After all the festivities were over, Oda Nobunaga took Yasuke with him back to Azuchi, which is where his clans command seat was, where Yasuke lodged with the guards. The Azuchi Castle was supposed to be one of the greatest castles at the time, at the top of this giant hill, and it was just a beautiful region. But at this point, Yasuke had grown a little bit disappointed in his new role, as essentially he was just a glorified guard. Nobunaga had mostly ignored him since he was taken, and he missed his close relationship that he had with Valignano. He was Valignano's #1 advisor. He was one of the most important people in the Jesuit mission, only to become just a basic bodyguard for a rich lord. But that quickly changed. His keen mind was very much sought after by Nobunaga over time. He was occasionally allowed to share meals with this warlord, which was a privilege not given to many men. He quickly became a favorite. Within a few short months, he was given his own private residence with his own private servants. A few months after that, he was made into a samurai. And that is how he became the only African samurai, the only black samurai to ever exist. Now, samurai during this time period were part of the ruling class. Peasants and merchants alike had to bow before them. They were that important. The word itself means to serve. So they were servants of their lords, but they were also extremely powerful in their presence. They held the highest honor in society, below the lords. Their word was law. They were famed for their sword art. And as time moved forward, Yasuke became more of a consultant than a bodyguard. He still kind of stayed on as an attendant for Nobunaga. And Nobunaga, being the very powerful and ambitious man that he is, decided to take on 2 wars on 2 different fronts to try to impose his rule. He wanted to unify Japan. He wanted to be the supreme ruler of all of Japan. One of the major rival clans that he had to go up against was the Mori, one that they've been at war with for a long time. But while he was fighting them, he was also fighting the peasant ninjas of Iga. This obviously meant he had to split his armies, and that made going very difficult. So he had to focus most of his attention on the Mori, because they were the more significant threat. And over time, they did defeat the Mori, kinda. And once the Mori were dealt with, he decided to go full in on taking on the ninjas in Iga. Yasuke was excited to finally get his first taste of battle, and they rode to Iga only to find out that the war had also already been won. So what they ended up doing there was just an inspection tour of the results of the war. During this inspection tour, they quickly found out that Iga were not completely defeated yet. If you know anything about ninjas, they hide. And so there were still pockets of resistance here and there, even though the war was won. At one point, they were actually ambushed in the snow, because it was during the winter time. The ninjas were throwing down smoke bombs to distract all the samurai so they could get in close and do damage. This is one of the first moments where Yasuke showed how formidable he was by taking down and defeating several ninjas. They were able to win the battle fairly handily, and it was just Yasuke's sheer size that allowed him to just overpower his opponents. When they finally wiped out that last pocket of resistance, Nobunaga only had one more enemy to deal with, and that was the Takeda clan. And the Takeda clan had been their biggest rival since way back when, but they had gotten some sort of a resurgence, and they had to get put down. Nobunaga did put them down as well, and Yasuke actually saw a lot of combat during that time period, but there wasn't a lot written about the conflict. So traditionally, the samurai who participated the most in the war and were the most influential in winning the war, they were typically given their own fiefdom, which was plots of land. Based on how successful Yasuke was, he was actually expected to be one of the ones to get this, and he was supposed to be given his own wife, as well as several concubines, and to live off of this land and to make a living that way. But he was actually very conflicted about receiving this. All the other samurais were saying, yeah, you're definitely getting this. And he was kind of excited about it, but kind of not, because he'd spent his whole life as a bodyguard, and he's like, well, I don't know if I can run land like this. That's not my thing. But he did not get a fiefdom. In fact, Nobunaga wanted him closer than ever, to which Yasuke actually breathed a sigh of relief, because he's like, okay, cool, I get to go back to doing what I do best. I ain't no landowner. And so this was the peak of Yasuke's life, the greatest moment he would ever achieve, to be one of the most influential and powerful samurais in all of the land, respected by everyone. But it would all only go downhill from here. You see, Nobunaga was a relatively cruel man. He did not treat prisoners of war well. Suffice to say, he unalived most of them in very brutal and calculated ways to make his enemies fear him. Problem is, that caused some of his allies to fear him as well, and that created detractors. One of those detractors was one of his most powerful generals. This was a man by the name of Akechi Mitsuhide. Akechi Mitsuhide was very put off by the fact that Nobunaga was so cruel and he unalived these captives. At one point in time, because he did this, Akechi's mother, who was imprisoned by the enemy, was also executed. So Akechi felt betrayed by his ruler. The problem for Akechi was that Nobunaga was pretty much untouchable during that time period. He was on the verge of unifying all of Japan, and he had so many supporters, but Akechi wanted to overthrow him to get his revenge for the death of his mother. But what he needed was a moment of isolation. And when the Mori threw one last counteroffensive against Nobunaga, Nobunaga sent his greatest general Hideyoshi to go deal with it, with the massive bulk of his army. And thinking he had already won and was about to unify Japan, Nobunaga returned to Honno-ji Temple, where he usually rested in between battles, with a very small force. Akechi, fresh off of the most recent war, thought now is the time to strike. He took his army and all of his men loyal to him. A lot of them were against what he was doing, but you didn't just betray your lord in those time periods. So a lot of them had to accept the fact that they were about to betray their ruler. One evening, in the middle of the night, Yasuke woke up and felt like something wasn't right. He heard screams in the distance, and he thought, this is not good. After waking up, grabbing his armor, grabbing his sword, he heard a battle cry from a conch shell, and he knew that they were under attack. He quickly went to his lord to protect Nobunaga and to try to get him out of there, because they knew, oh my gosh, if we're under attack right now, we're gonna get overwhelmed. This is not good. As they were trying to escape, Nobunaga actually got hit in the leg with an arrow, and he couldn't walk anymore. Yasuke tried to kind of carry him out, but they kept getting attacked and overwhelmed, and they had such a small fighting force that they couldn't really get him out of there. Luckily, they were able to repel the invaders quite a bit as they were moving about the complex, but Nobunaga knew it was over. He said, we're overwhelmed, we're not getting out of here, there's no chance. And knowing that he was going to die, he told Yasuke, he says, you need to escape, you need to go tell my son that he needs to rule now. And his final words were, my head and sword to Nobutada, never let them fall to the enemy. And so Yasuke's task was to take his head and his sword to his son, Nobutada, and then he committed seppuku right then and there, which was the Japanese way of unaliving yourself. It's kind of the opening up of the stomach. You can look it up yourself. I'm trying not to get too graphic. Yasuke took his head and his sword and had to sneak through alone to get out by himself while the rest of the samurai fought to the end. He hopped the wall of the complex, managed to escape. He headed to the north to find Nobutada and pledged his sword to the son of his ruler. Nobutada was grief-stricken at the loss of his father, but he knew that it was his time now and he had to carry on the name. He rallied his men along with Yasuke, who is now his #1 guy. They headed to Nijo Palace where they could better defend themselves from this random onslaught. He sent out messengers to Hideyoshi to be like, hey, I need you to come back here. We're in trouble. We're getting betrayed. But Akechi Mitsuhide had prepared for this and was already coming to attack Nijo Palace. Once again, it was surrounded and they had no chance to survive. Nobutada also committed seppuku when surrounded, just like his father. This time, Yasuke had no way to escape. It was over. He was fighting to the end. This was it. And so while him and the remaining bodyguards fought to the end, it was said that he took down 6 men by himself, and then he took down 10 men by himself, and his ferocity was unmatched. This was his greatest last stand. I mean, this is something that you'd find in an epic movie, but this was a real moment where he was fighting to the last gasping breath. But eventually, he was overwhelmed. They swarmed him, they took him off of his feet, and then he was spared. He blacked out and woke up later to find out he was still alive. And he wondered why? Why was he still alive after all that? Well, I'll tell you why. There's a good reason. The real reason he spared Yasuke was because he was a prominent member of the Jesuits, and because Akechi needed the Jesuit support to try to take over Japan by himself, because the Jesuits were so powerful in the region. So Yasuke was returned to the Jesuits, and Azuchi was completely burned to the ground. This beautiful palace, everything that Nobunaga had worked for, was destroyed. But Akechi rescued all of the Jesuits from Azuchi, and he says, look at me, look what I did. I rescued you from Nobunaga, and now you owe me. But this story has an even bigger twist. Akechi Mitsuhide died 13 days later.
What?
You see, what he hadn't accounted for was that General Hideyoshi, who was Nobunaga's biggest supporter, the guy that I talked to you about at the beginning, who saved Yasuke from the crowd in Kyoto, you see, he was off fighting the Mori still, and he had intercepted a message that the Mori had sent to Akechi that had proposed an alliance. And so Hideyoshi knew something was up. He knew ahead of time that Akechi was going to betray them. He had already begun backing his army out in full haste to try to get back, because he knew that Nobunaga was in trouble and that the Mori were not that important at that moment. They needed to deal with this betrayal. So he returned very shortly after Nobunaga had been dethroned and his sons had been eliminated. Considering Hideyoshi had the most powerful army in all of the land at that time period and the full backing of all of Nobunaga's other generals, he laid waste to Akechi's army. Within in a few short days, and finished off Akechi himself. He actually came right into his camp, burned the whole camp down to the ground, and eliminated all of the betrayers. And so Hideyoshi became the de facto ruler of Japan for a short time period. He was more of a general than a ruler, so he didn't have the same designs that Nobunaga had in terms of unification. He was more of a follower than a leader, but he still ended up being a good leader for that time period. Yasuke remained with the Jesuits in Kyoto for many, many months, and he waited and waited and waited to hear of any word of Oda Nobunaga's surviving sons, to see if he could get back into the clan, or even just anything from Hideyoshi to say that he could return, but no word ever came for him. His time period as a powerful attendant to the country's most powerful clan was at an end, so he really didn't have any goal or life path anymore. So what he did is he returned to Nagasaki, where he was the organizer of the military there, and he resumed that role, training recruits for the militia. The Jesuits came with, their power had started to wane a bit in Japan once they lost Nobunaga as a powerful ally. So returning to Nagasaki, they went to help the young lord, who wasn't quite as young anymore, Arima, the kid who had the wispy mustache, because he was in charge of Nagasaki now, and this was necessary for them to maintain their power in Nagasaki. He was once again being attacked by anti-Catholic Japanese along the coastline. Yasuke was so popular in Japan that he was very quickly given a leadership position in this campaign, and he was in charge of a whole regiment, mostly Ronin that he had trained himself, and he was well trusted by the Japanese people to be a major leader. As a military commander and wielding 2 guns as well as his samurai swords, he led a firing squad to beat back invaders along the beachfront, and it was reported that he was a massive influence on winning this battle for the people of Arima as a military commander and a strategist. But that's it. That's the end of the story. There is no more history in the history books for Yasuke at this point, which is crazy because his name just disappeared from the planet. It was speculated that maybe he died in this final battle, this popular battle known as the Battle of Okinawate, but there's also no evidence of his passing. And considering how popular he was, and that he was also said to have been such an influential commander who helped win this battle, there should have been evidence that he would have passed as well, right? But there was just nothing after this in the whole record books. Historians speculate that he could have retired to a simpler life with the Jesuits after this, considering they didn't have much power in Japan anymore. Maybe he was just a bodyguard for different traders, like he did with Valignano. People speculate he could have become a pirate. There was a lot more piracy buildup during that time period, but it just didn't seem right for his moral character. The important thing to note is that no missionary ever recorded his name again. The Jesuits wrote everything down, so if he'd stuck around with the Jesuits, he probably would have been mentioned somewhere. That doesn't seem likely either. It's also important to mention that he was extremely wealthy by this time period too. So why would he turn to piracy? Why would he be a simple bodyguard for traders? And he was extremely popular, so he could have gone anywhere, done anything that he wanted. So I speculate that maybe he just retired and got a fiefdom, like he had thought about earlier, married a wife, settled down, disappeared from society. That's what I think. But most historians think that he actually likely went back under employ for Hideyoshi, who had not called on him before. The evidence for this is there was a general under Lord Hideyoshi by the name of General Kato, and this General Kato had an African under his command, under the name of Kurobo. There's no evidence to speculate that this was necessarily Yasuke, but there's not much evidence that there were other Africans in Japan during that time period either, so he could have just changed his name. And the other evidence that General Kato might have undertaken him after this battle at Battle Okinawate is that he actually regularly traded with Nagasaki. He was one of the main envoys to Nagasaki, so it would have made sense that he was in Nagasaki. He ran into Yasuke. Yasuke's like, whatever, I'm gonna put this life behind me. Let me just go be a warrior, which was my calling. And so maybe he lived out his days serving Lord Hideyoshi's military under this general. But we will never know. The end of his story is a mystery. But what I can tell you is that he became a very prominent and influential samurai in Japan, and he achieved great success with Lord Nobunaga before his untimely passing. And if Nobunaga had survived, he could have been one of the most powerful consultants in the entire world with his knowledge and military skills. And that is today why we discuss the story of Yasuke, the only black samurai in history. Now, I'm excited to get my hands on Assassin's Creed Shadows at some point in time. I don't know what the character is going to portray in the game, but I'm recording this before the games come out, so no idea what he's going to be like in the game. It might not even be the same story. But I wanted to deliver to you guys the true story today so you can understand that he was a real-life character and he was a very interesting character. I got most of this information from Yasuke, In Search of the African Samurai by Thomas Lockley. It's a really good book, about 500 pages, and I recommend everybody check it out.